everybody. Raul here for Bass Musician Magazine, and today we have the extraordinary honor and pleasure of chatting with bassist Anthony Muthurajah. Yay!
Hey, Raul, and you got the name right, so kudos to that.
Yay! Yay! So, Anthony, as always, we like to find out about how you got your start in music and on bass.
Well, for me, music started at a young age in church, but I started with the drums. So for the longest time, I played drums, and then I started playing guitar, and the bass was the last thing I actually picked up when I went to college. It was a typical situation of there being too many guitar players and no bass players, and I just started playing for people, and then everything changed from there. Yep.
Got you. And I know that you pursued formal studies. You went through one of the Berkeley programs.
Yeah, so they're actually a college that was part of the Berkeley International Network, and they are based out of Malaysia. So I did do a few semesters there. So yeah, went in as a guitar player, but I switched my major to bass in my second semester. Yeah.
Very interesting. And you've got a couple of recording, couple of records. The Road Not Taken was your debut. Perennial was the second one that was out most recently. Tell us about your music and your inspiration.
Well, from a composition standpoint, I like to kind of create music based on texture and sound as opposed to thinking of a melody and what chord goes with it, because that's usually the route people take, or having chords and then trying to put melody to it. So as far as very direct influences go, two names come to mind. One is Jaco, obviously, who wrote outside of the realm of the bass, being the instrument. He wrote music.
Mm-hmm.
And the other influence is Alan Holdsworth. So these are the two guys that I kind of lean towards in terms of inspiration with the sound and the way I approach the whole process. Yeah.
Got you. So for most part, you'd say it's very much kind of falling within jazz?
Ish. Yeah. I mean, the improv element is very evident, but I grew up with a lot of gospel and heavy metal and reggae. So while you might not hear very direct components of those styles, the influence is kind of there. There is a bit of an edge to the way I would play, even in an acoustic format. So it's like I tell people, I might not necessarily play metal anymore, but I'm still a metalhead. I love metal just as much as I used to. So it comes through sometimes. Yeah.
Well, and it's very fascinating because you are in Dubai, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
And there's so many other musical influences in the Middle East, and you haven't really mentioned any of those as far as things because reggae, yeah. I think other places, metal, I think here, maybe Europe.
It's rather interesting because the environment I grew up, one thing in the Middle East, being born and raised here, is that it's so diverse and multicultural, but from a very different point of view, because like, for example, the church I went to, I'm from Sri Lanka, so you had Sri Lankan people, you had Indians, you had Filipinos, you had Americans, you had people from the UK, and they all just kind of brought their own thing in there too. So there's a lot of cross culture that happens here in that sense. So while it is interesting because I am also quite influenced by Arabic rhythms, Arabic and North African rhythms, but I don't take anything directly from it just because I grew up with it. It's just kind of naturally made its way in. So I don't really try to reach out for something unless I'm trying to be specific. Otherwise, usually I just approach things from a very open space. Yeah.
Fascinating. And I know that especially one of the universal characteristics of music is and especially when we hear I'll call it world music, because of the internet, because of the ways we're communicating nowadays, there has been a blending and a merging of so many of these forms. And it really becomes, I'm going to say, especially in the United States, for us to hear Middle Eastern tones and Arabic, usually it's because somebody here hears them, is fascinated by them, and decides, oh, I'm going to incorporate those. A great example, when we think of Beatles incorporating sitar music into their repertoire, that you'd go, none of us had heard of sitars before that. And I know sitars have been around much longer. Or John McLaughlin with his Mahavishnu stuff and so a lot of the percussive elements and how things are described, I'll call it Western cultures reaching out to embrace those because they find them so novel. Yet for the rest of the world, it's often the other way around, where they tend to embrace all these other things and going, well, I know this. I'm so surrounded by this, but this other thing is very interesting.
I mean, that's a great point you made, because a lot of people ask me that too. How did you get into jazz, being where you're from and where you were raised? It's like I had access to certain styles of music out here, being in the Middle East, and metal was one of those. So as much as I loved Pantera and Metallica and all the good stuff, Slayer, when I started checking out jazz, I was just like, there's something there that I never heard before. And I realized, yeah, in order for me to really go into it, I really have to go in deep, you know? So it's not the most accessible sound out here, but I think that further intrigued me to just deep dive with it, you know? So it is quite true that you would be surrounded with a lot of things, but somehow what is outside of your little circle tends to call out to you. And I think it's an important thing to pay attention to.
Gotcha. Well, and I know that certainly you've got your own music. And then, of course, if you're a working musician, because you do both session work, you do a lot of, live shows, you're going to step up to play whatever it is that is called for, whatever the book is. And in addition to that, you're an educator. You've dedicated quite a segment of your efforts. I know you've got significant presence on YouTube and all that to your educational efforts. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, for me, the whole idea of why I wanted to start teaching was just give bass players an avenue to study music and not bass necessarily, because I always tell this to anybody: beyond technique, we need to study music. Because once the technique is established on your instrument, we need to study musical content and ideas and concepts and stuff like that. So I always compiled all the material I worked on through the years, and handwritten notes to stuff I've typed out or just random thoughts, and that has been the bulk of the content I put out on YouTube. It was an interesting barrier to get into, to break through, because because more than often, what people want is rather direct information. Hey, here's a lick, this is how we do it. But rather I talk about what makes the lick work, why does it work, and how you can actually just use it freely outside of where it's actually present. So that kind of became my kind of a thing, and I just really started to go with it, and it's done well, and I'm quite happy with what I've got going in that sense. And to also see and hear bass players just opening up beyond just, hey, playing the bass, like study harmony, study piano players, orchestral music and stuff like that. So it's been fun. I really enjoy the process of teaching, if not for anything, just for the fact that I constantly feel like a student teaching, so I love that. I love being in that phase where I'm just learning something new, whether it's just one thing or two or a bunch of things. So yeah, learning is such a fun and never-ending process. So that alone inspires me to keep doing this.
Well, and it always helps in the process when you have to look at something and clarify, even to yourself, how to present it to someone else. There's learning in that as well, and clarification. And I think it is one of the hallmarks of good teachers, where they have taken a concept that many times may be elusive to a student. They'll look at something, and I'll use for a classic example with a lot of theory and things. A lot of people want to close down at the mention of theory, of any theory. Like, oh no, I just want to play. I don't want to get into this stuff. And there's lots of ways to go about learning music, and it hasn't always been so formalized. And certainly, I think as we look back historically with mankind and music being passed down before there was written music, there was so much that was passed from person to person, and the tunes were memorized. And even this is true with a lot of the early jazz. None of that stuff was written. So many people just, they just played it. And if it got recorded, yay, other people could hear it, but otherwise it may be lost forever. But the ability to dissect and pick apart and make sense so that another person can go, oh, now I see, instead of it being so arid and presented, today we're going to talk about the circle of fifths and blah, 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 that people just glaze over and go, I can't possibly deal with that.
Yeah, it's, because for me, that was my biggest struggle too. I really wanted to get into the whole, I don't want to call it theory, let's just call it, I don't know, the mechanics,
Sure.
And just the way it was presented just always put me off, like modes. because it's like, oh, you have Dorian, you have Ionian, you have that. I'm just like, but it's one scale. Like, why do I have to think 7 times about the same thing?
Yeah.
So small things like that. And my mentor also always tried to get me to study a certain way. He's like, whatever you study and you absorb, try to also think of it in terms of translation to somebody else, not just through music, but also in words. As in, how would you explain yourself?
Mm-hmm.
If you do something and somebody asks you, hey, how did you approach that? He said, you better be able to explain yourself, because that would really solidify the knowledge, but also the execution of said knowledge. So it's a tricky process. And I know bass players freak out the minute they hear the T word theory, but I think it is a lot simpler than it sounds. It always is.
Mm-hmm.
People freak out, like, or even something simple like reading music. Now, it's funny because I'm just doing this bunch of gigs this week where I'm sight reading about 25, 26 songs a day, and it's very taxing, but it's not as difficult, and this is also because I haven't been reading for a while, but then getting back into it is just like, oh, I'm rusty. But then sit with it for a bit, it starts to come back, and it's not as complicated as it sounds or it's presented. So I would encourage anybody. It's hard to say something's not for you, something's for that guy. It's not for everyone. You won't know until you try.
Mm-hmm.
There's always a simple workaround to anything. Yeah.
It is an ongoing dispute in the music, and I'll say in the bass community more than anything, because there are so many different approaches to doing the bass job. And if, for example, you are lucky enough to start with the band and play the same music for 40 years, it doesn't require a whole lot more of insight and analysis.
Yep.
As long as you can play the songs, then you're good to go. Whereas what you're describing, if you throw somebody in with a book that is chock full of nuances and details and all of this stuff, and you need to know it now, you don't have a month to learn it. You can't just take your time graciously getting into it. It is certainly a more complicated situation. We should talk about how you get your sound. What kind of gear are you playing on?
Well, for the last couple of years, I've just been using everyone knows me for my Squire, my jazz bass, but it's purely stock, just change the bridge. And as far as my actual pedal board or anything, let me just put this right here. This thing is quite a funny little device. My friend modified it for me out in India. It's the B2.1U from Zoom.
Mm-hmm.
And he modded it in such a way I use this exact same thing for my guitar as well. So usually when I play live, I have this and I go straight to the house. I actually stopped using amps unless I'm playing a big arena or something.
Mm-hmm.
I just go straight out to the house. I seem to enjoy the sound of just the bass signal going out. It feels bigger, or maybe I'm just imagining it, but yeah, so that's about it. I don't use anything over and above that. Sometimes I used to take this guy out. This is the SY300. It's a synth. It's a guitar synth. So on certain gigs where I can get a little adventurous, I might just throw on an organ sound and just play a solo. But besides that, that's about it, really. Nothing more. I keep it quite clean and simple.
Yep. Gotcha. And do you have a preference in strings?
Yes. So on my 4, I've always used DR. 40 to 95, that gauge particularly is something that is hard to come by with other companies, because I do use lighter strings, because I've also had injuries and I've broken my thumb and wrist in the past as a teenager, so I need something that doesn't fight me too much.
Mm-hmm.
So I use 40 to 95 DRs. I believe they're the Sunbeams. Yeah, that's my go-to. Yep.
Very nice. And one element that a lot of people tend to overlook, instrument cables. Do you have a particular preference with those?
Not really. What I used to actually do was I used to just buy cables in bulk and just solder cables. I prefer doing that, but I haven't done that in a while. So at the moment, what am I using? I think I've got these Planet Waves. Yeah, just simple mono cables, and I have a bunch of stereo cables that I get made here. But for my instruments, yeah, at the moment it's Planet Waves.
Well, and as long as you're able to do some of your own repairs too, I think the biggest issue with cables, especially when you're touring and they're on the road, they get so beaten up and abused.
Yep.
that they can fail. And for a lot of people, the only solution is run out and buy another one. They may not know how to fix it or what to do with it. So that is a critical component. And as we
Yep.
look ahead, I know we're coming right now where I am, we're kind of trying to get out of the end of the pandemic. I know it's affected the world around in terrible ways. And in a lot of places, they're way worse than we are right here, with no end in sight necessarily. But what plans do you have for the future?
Well, at the moment, I'm writing some new music, but I'm not doing it as a record. I'm just going to put out singles. Fairly different approach to writing this time, something more thematic in nature. So that's an ongoing process, and I'm also currently in the process of trying to move out of here, and hopefully that should pull through, and I should be out of here by next year, sometime before next year summer, hopefully. Outside of that, I am actually planning a recording project with a good friend of mine, a piano player based out of LA, Mahesh Balasurya. We did record here in Dubai 2 years ago, actually. Yeah, he was here. And we did record, but it didn't really work out. But this time we're working on original music. And he's a Sri Lankan American, so we have this common link. So we just thought, hey, let's try to do something about that. So hopefully that happens around the summer next year. Depending on how things look with COVID, I think it should happen more than likely, but fingers crossed.
I'll come back, because one of the videos I watched, you basically played all the instruments yourself. And
Yeah.
you were able to, of course, because of your background in drumming, obviously that was very comfortable. But when you're doing everything, I know that sometimes it's difficult to think like each individual musician. Like, for example, a bass player, when you get on guitar or back and forth, guitar players, when they try to play bass, tend to do too much. They tend to noodle, they tend to overdo it. And many people that play like all instruments, you can really tell their strengths, but why I found it to be very even on all the things that you were doing. You had a very nice balance there. How do you kind of achieve that?
For me, it was every instrument I picked up, I constantly correlated it to one another. So it's like on both my records, I played everything. And it was interesting because I was able to put together a band, but then I thought, by the time I explained myself to a drummer, a guitar player, and a keys player, it would take a while. And it's not a bad thing. It's something I'm willing to explore if you're playing live. I'm more than happy to welcome anybody's input into the music. But on a record, I just am a little too specific, and I can be very annoying about it. So as over time, what happened was, like, for instance, when I started playing bass, I completely had to stop playing the guitar because the touch on the instrument is different, because you can hear a bass player playing guitar just from the way the guitar sounds a little boomy, for instance. So to develop that guitar touch again after playing bass for so many years, I had to stop playing the guitar. But once I picked it back up, it's just like, oh, okay, I just kind of know what kind of a switch I need to flick before I pick up the guitar. And the same thing with the drums. So everything I do usually is in relevance to what the music needs. So as in when needed, I will push it from whichever instrument that I have to. So yeah, I always encourage anybody, whether they just sing or even play the triangle, just look at the entire context of it. It'll really help you solidify the part and the way you approach music overall. Because even as a functioning bass player in an orchestra gig, I want to care about what the first violin is playing, even if it has nothing to do with me. It's just so I know how to really go and give the music everything it needs. So it's the same case with me playing the other instruments as well. I think from that wide perspective all the time.
Absolutely. Well, and you're in good company, because Wolfgang Van Halen's most recent release is he played all the instruments himself. And
Yeah, he did.
He's out on tour now. And one of the questions I asked him about was, how do you find musicians that play what you played to your satisfaction? Because since you did it yourself.
Yeah,
so that
It's a tricky one, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and Anthony, if people want to stay on top of what you're doing, where's the best place to look?
Well, there's Instagram, Anthony Muthurajah, and my YouTube channel. These are the two places where I'm primarily active.
Mhm.
I'm also there on Facebook, Anthony Muthurajah Music, but algorithms and stuff. So it's social media is tricky stuff, by the way, for anyone who's wondering. But yeah, Instagram and YouTube, Anthony Muthurajah. That's where you can stay up to date with whatever I do.
Excellent. Well, we're very much looking forward to hearing more of your music, and we'll definitely stay on top of all of these details. I know you'll let us know when new projects and things come up. Folks, you've
Absolutely.
seen him here, Anthony Muthurajah, coming to you on Bass Musician Magazine.